I'm calling this video No Magic Bullets because what we're going to do here is talk about the importance of getting beyond pretty simplistic ideas about media effects. So, the phrase magic bullets you may have read in basic communications and media studies textbooks. Another phrase that you might have heard is the phrase hypodermic needle. In both instances, they're suggesting a model of media influence where media either shoot or inject audiences with influence and immediately change the way that they think and the way that they behave. This is obviously quite often related to advertising or media violence. And the important thing to recognize is that even amongst effects researchers, even amongst psychologists who do experiments on how media exposure does lead to certain kinds of changes amongst audiences, no one ever believed in that model of effect. No one ever thought that there were magic bullets or that there were hypodermic needles. It's an interesting history for a variety of historical reasons. Some researchers were made to look for those sorts of effects. But very early on in the 20th century, researchers begin to realize that those sorts of direct, immediate media effects really kind of don't exist in any substantial way, and there are far more important ways to think about media influence. And one of the places where we move from a model of media influence that looks at immediate changes in thoughts and actions toward questions of socialization is in research on representations of women and how that relates to gender norms in society. So, moving away from ideas of magic bullets and hypodermic needles, what that means is shifting our focus. When we're thinking about how media influence audiences, instead of thinking about how exposure to particular kinds of stories, particular kinds of messages produces immediate changes, instead, we begin to think about how do media serve as agents of socialization? That is, how does the exposure to a kind of a consistent set of stories that tell us the same things over and over again, how does that affect how we view society? And how does that socialize us into adopting particular kinds of identities, particular kinds of roles, and accepting them as natural and fair and nothing to be questioned? And naturally, gender is one of the most important issues where that's been seen. So, here's a photograph, which one of the areas that we know that this has been explored in is in the role of Disney in getting a very early hold of girls when they're very, very young and socializing them into a kind of a particular kind of gender order. Now, one of the things that we will see in the history of gender is that many societies have firm economic and social interests in maintaining patriarchy and maintaining a world where women are given limited options in terms of who they can be and what they can do, and that actually getting them to accept that that's just the way things are and that's the way things should be is an important process, and the media play an important role in that process. And one of the places where this has been seen is in repetitive themes in Disney movies. These are typically the sorts of first things that the first kind of media experiences that girls often have, and they're frequently entertained, I use that word advisedly, with stories about women who, one way or another, are reliant on a Prince Charming to save them. So the message is, as I quite often say to my daughter, when she was starting to watch these things, the lesson of this is that, you don't need to sit around and wait for some asshole to rescue you. You should do it yourself. And I do use the word asshole, and that's why I'm presenting it here. So the idea is that these ideas end up being political. That we think of these things as being fairly innocuous fairy tale cartoons, which are there to keep our kids entertained for a couple of hours or so, and they're actually not. The idea is that these cartoons actually present us with and normalize certain political ideas. And we have to deal with those ideas somehow. This princess myth, this idea that we live in a world where there are gender differences, there are differences in gendered opportunities, and somehow that's just the way things are, and that's the way things need to be. This is an important aspect of understanding the media's social role, and this is one of the reasons why research on media on women audiences has been so important to exploring that kind of general socialization, long-term subtle influence model of media influence. But I want to just sort of think again about because the argument here, and one of the things that studies of women audiences show is that we're not suggesting that these are indeed magic bullets, that young girls see these Disney princess stories over and over again and think, well, that's my future too, and that's fine, and that, as long as I'm beautiful and slightly funny but not too funny, slightly sassy but not too sassy, everything will be okay because I'll get the right guy. It's not that everybody believes that, and I suppose in that regard, one of the things that we find from studies of female audiences is that female audiences read these stories in a number of different ways to different outcomes. And this allows us to get back to the significance of using a religious metaphor to compare, to think about media use and how media use has a social role. So you'll recall early on that I compared the question that we're asking today to Methodism, and the idea of kind of thinking that there's some kind of analogy between a TV audience and a religious audience, the sorts of audiences that were drawn to Methodist church practices in the early 19th century, late 18th and early 19th century. And if you look around, you'll see that scholars quite often compare TV to a church. And I want to just think a little bit more about what that means. Here we have the cover of a very important document in British history, which is the Elizabethan Book of Prayer. You may have heard of Queen Elizabeth I, a very, very famous English queen who was really remarkably politically, had just achieved remarkable things politically. She came to the throne as not the first, but one of the first English queens. She was in constant political danger and indeed mortal danger because of her gender, constantly under political threats, motivated by a variety of things, her religion and her gender. And yet she reigned for a remarkable half a century and was responsible for really an equally remarkable ability to maintain political stability in what was a very turbulent time. And one of the ways that she did this was through establishing a particular form of religious practice. At the time, England was torn between, broadly speaking, the Catholic and Protestant faiths. And what Queen Elizabeth did was she came up with a form of a religious settlement based on the Book of Common Prayer. We don't need to go into what that all meant. But what it basically meant was she was aware that her subjects believed a variety of different things, religiously speaking. And what she wanted to allow people to think whatever they wanted to, as long as they behaved in a particular manner. So they said, look, what the Book of Common Prayer said was that, look, when you show up at an English Protestant church, you can believe anything you want to believe in your head, as long as you show up. As long as you show up a certain amount of times a year, as long as you go through the rituals, as long as you go through the performances, as long as you get on your knees to pray, as long as you accept the sacrament, the body of Christ, the blood of Christ, as long as you do all these things, I don't care what you believe in your head. So she was very much interested in simply people showing up at church, and whatever they thought when they got there and whatever they said afterwards didn't matter to her. Now, we can say the same things about TV industries. TV industries don't really care what you do with their products. They don't care what you think when you're watching TV shows. You can make anything up you want as long as you pay attention, as long as you actually watch the TV shows, watch the movies, whatever it is. And this is really the basis for audience research, because what this shows, what audience research shows, is how a common set of practices, the act of watching TV, for example, has actually led to a diverse brand of cultural practices. People do all kinds of amazing things around TV content. So you can have two people looking at the same different content. They can see very, very different meanings. And what qualitative audience research, what critical audience research is about, partly, is about looking at how people develop different meanings around the same content and lead that to different sorts of social outcomes in the lives that they live.